All right, just ending the press conference that everyone has been waiting for all day, shorter than I think many people thought, and a very broad touch on the pursuing peace narrative by both presidents. Obviously, President Putin starting with the history and historical relations of Alaska, the United States, and Russia as a whole, and then obviously going on to talk about Ukraine, the ties that they both have. But he really did double down on Russian interests and wanting to annex and make part of Ukraine, if not all of Ukraine, a part of Russia, which is something that many people around the globe are starting to question. So we do want to bring in our professor, Klaus Lehrs, who is a distinguished professor from UNC Chapel Hill. And Klaus, great to have you here. I just want to start with first what you heard. Did anything surprise you? And like I said, pretty short between these two to take this press conference. Really was less than 10 minutes almost.
Yeah, that was a little surprising, and thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here. What was surprising, I think, was the tone of both men. You know, they really spoke like old friends who really missed each other. They had only seen each other last in 2019, so 6 years ago. And Trump seemed to really appreciate Putin. He spoke of him like an old friend. He once again said that there was no Russia hoax, that Putin had always understood him, and he referred to Putin as Vladimir with his first name. So, you know, after all, the Russians have invaded Ukraine, and Putin is well known for killing his opponents domestically and doing all sorts of very nasty things. And to meet with such a man might be necessary, but to meet in such a warm way, I wonder whether that made sense and whether that was necessary. And I think Trump will get a lot of criticism for that. But he sees Putin as a loyal friend, someone he can rely on. And this is quite shocking.
Well, speaking of some shocking images, Klaus, I think you probably saw this. I don't think I've ever seen an ally or even an adversary join with the president of the then United States in his presidential limousine, the Beast as they call it. And in fact, you saw them exchange words. No translator that I saw got into that limo with them. And I do know that President Putin understands and knows English enough to hold a conversation. So I think that will be really one of the astonishing images that will come out of this. Obviously, we saw as both men went into the Beast, a B-2 bomber flying overhead with 4 F-22 Raptors flanking it. They rode past Spirit, the B-2 bomber, on the ground. So maybe some shows of strength. But in fact, President Putin didn't have to do anything to get this meeting, and it happened here in the United States. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it started with a ceremony at the beginning, and what you just said, that very warm welcome, the red carpet for Putin, and then riding in the limousine with Trump by himself. And who knows what the two men agreed upon in that car, what they talked about. Perhaps they just made small talk, may well have been the case. Maybe they already talked about the forthcoming meeting and how they wanted to direct that meeting. We will never know because notes were not taken, interpreters were not there. We don't know what is happening between these two men. And we know that Trump always had a fascination with Vladimir Putin. Some people have argued, though that hasn't been proven, that Putin has some sort of negative proof on his bad doings in the past. We don't know about that. But, you know, when you look at the friendly relationship between Putin, after all, a war criminal, an aggressor who has started a war, he invaded Crimea in 2014 and then invaded Ukraine in a full-scale way in 2022, and Trump treats him like an old friend. This is shocking, and it started right at the beginning with the welcoming ceremony.
Well, it certainly did, and really juxtaposed from his first term, as you remember, I'm sure, Klaus, that the president stuck with the Obama administration's sanctions, which are still around. But as you said, it really was striking to see the two meet each other, greet each other, smile in one each other's, handshakes, because we saw very different scenes when President Obama met with then President Vladimir Putin as well. So let's just talk about those relations. And do you see this setting the stage potentially for part of the territory of Ukraine, or maybe all of it, to be annexed to Russia. Because as we both listened to, Vladimir Putin was very forthright in doubling down on his need and necessity to make Ukraine a part of Russia. Did you kind of hear the same thing?
Yeah, and the only concession Putin seems to have made was by actually going to US territory, to Alaska. That was the only small concession he made. Apart from that, he doesn't seem to have withdrawn from any of his demands, which he has had for many years now, that really Ukraine is part of Russia, that Ukraine should not be a sovereign nation state, but should really be under the influence of Russia. That is his demand at the beginning in 2014, 2022, and it still seems to be his demand. We have not heard anything in that press conference about a ceasefire, and Trump always went into the meeting, said he wants to achieve a ceasefire. Instead, that was hardly mentioned. We only know there might be another meeting, perhaps a meeting taking place in Moscow. We still don't know whether that is a meeting between Trump and Putin again, or whether Zelensky will be allowed to join that meeting. And of course, that displays the whole terrible scenario of having a meeting between an aggressor state and the American president, and the other warring party, the invaded party, the victim, Ukraine, was not allowed to participate in that meeting. This is shocking, and that is not what is normally done in diplomacy. If you want to mediate, and often mediation by the United States is often a sensible idea, and Trump himself has done it successfully, for example, only last week with Azerbaijan and Armenia, where both presidents were invited to the White House and a deal was worked out. Admittedly, that deal was based on what the Biden administration had achieved, but still Trump used America's good offices to bring the two presidents closer together. So Zelensky should also have been there in Alaska. It is clear if the United States wants to mediate, then both parties to the conflict should be there, but Zelensky was not allowed to be there. And we all know that last week and the week before, Zelensky desperately tried to be invited, to be there at the meeting. And then there also was talk, perhaps immediately after the Putin-Trump meeting, there would be another meeting with Zelensky, but that doesn't seem to be on the agenda for the time being. And whether Zelensky really wants to travel to Moscow to meet with Putin, that I very much doubt.
You make some great points, Professor Lars. I mean, it is very unorthodox to be speaking about a ceasefire, about that country without that country's leader in the presence of the other folks that are talking about that ceasefire. So I agree. I think a lot of folks are watching this and waiting for what is next, although I don't know if anyone knows. And in fact, we did see reports from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky just a number of hours ago that Russia continues its offensive of Ukraine. So that does not back down. And it seems, Professor Lars, that the UN, the EU, they are anxiously watching this because this could mean potentially bigger ramifications for Eastern Europe, right? I mean, if Ukraine is annexed in any way, we saw Crimea annexed in the early 2010s. And that obviously created some instability in that region. Other folks were wondering what was next. So set the scene for us in what it looks like in Eastern Europe and why there's such a hesitancy for Ukraine to be a part of Russia.
Yeah, I think the big question is first the ceasefire. Will there be a ceasefire or not? Has something like that been agreed? And will Trump continue American financial and intelligence aid to Ukraine, or has he agreed with Putin to stop that aid? Because the Europeans are in the difficult position that they deliver and provide almost 50% of both military and financial aid to Ukraine, but 50% is only half of what the Ukrainians need. And the Europeans are not in a position, for example, to replace the American intelligence network. They simply haven't got the resources to do that. And also some of the military aid can only be delivered by the United States. So the Europeans, if they are left with having to make up for the aid the United States has so far delivered to Ukraine, the Europeans couldn't replace that. And that, of course, puts them in a very difficult situation. And they all know if Putin gets away with invading Ukraine and coming out as a victor and perhaps conquering Ukraine to a large extent, or be able to replace Zelensky with a puppet government in Kiev, then Putin may go into other countries in Europe. Moldova comes to mind, Georgia comes to mind, where the Russians already possess two territories which are part of Georgia, but they are occupied by the Russians. And perhaps Estonia comes to mind, and even the Poles are very concerned what Putin might do next. Personally, I don't think that Putin will immediately start invading other countries in Eastern Europe, but it cannot be totally ruled out. And you certainly have to make provisions to make sure that Putin realizes there would be very strong resistance. So the Europeans are in a very difficult position. And Trump has the tendency to mix economic and security concerns. He can always threaten, if the Europeans are not coming on board, that there will be higher tariffs on European exports to the United States. And he can also threaten that he may have second thoughts about staying in NATO, that perhaps the United States will leave NATO after all, despite the 5% increase of defense expenditure, which has been agreed recently. So Trump has really all the cards, and the Europeans, despite the Europe being economically strong, they're militarily quite weak. The Europeans are really dependent on the United States. And of course, the same applies to Ukraine. Ukraine is totally dependent on American military aid and also financial and intelligence aid. Without the United States, really, it is very doubtful whether the Europeans and Ukraine can continue the war for any length of time in a successful way.
A brilliant explanation, Professor Lars. That really puts it in layman's terms for us to understand. I got to ask, and I don't know if you heard this, did I hear that President Putin had said that if President Trump was president back in 2022, that there would be no war? What did you think about hearing that? Can I ask you?
Yes, I did hear that as well. I think that it has less to do with the facts on the ground, but with flattering Trump. You know, Trump has been saying that for many years now, that if he had been president, the peace would have been preserved. And Putin just repeats that to flatter and impress Trump. Putin, of course, wants to be on the good side of Trump. He knows that what I just said about the Europeans, that also applies to Putin, that the cards are with the American president. And if he can stay on very friendly terms with Trump, that means a lot for his success in Ukraine. And if he falls out with Trump, then he has a severe problem. The American president can put a lot of sanctions on the Russian economy. He can provide even more aid to Ukraine. He can do all sorts of things which make life for Russia and for the war in Ukraine they are fighting very, very difficult. So Putin is really dependent on staying on the good side of Trump. But Putin is a very skillful negotiator. He's a very clever and smart man. And he seems to have outmaneuvered Trump at that meeting in Alaska, certainly judging by the press conference we just listened to. And of course, he has been outmaneuvering Trump and playing Trump for the last few months, because Trump and the Europeans have been pushing for a ceasefire for many months now. And Putin has always avoided and evaded that question and managed to continue the war. He talks nicely about a ceasefire, says he also wants a ceasefire, he also wants to see peace, but then he continues bombing Ukrainian cities and hitting civilians very, very hard. And as you just said, while Putin and Trump were meeting in Alaska, the Russian bombing attacks on Ukrainian cities continued. This, to me, does not look like a man of peace. Putin wants to continue the war until he has won in Ukraine.
Let's quickly talk about the weaknesses and strengths. I had kind of alluded to that. I mean, and you just talked about it. I mean, President Putin had barely needed to do anything to walk on American soil today, and as you said, seemed to have the upper hand. It seemed like a lot of the gestures today, there was, trying to be a show of strength by the United States, but it seems like in some of the op-eds that I've read, that President Putin could see some of this as a weakness. What happened today? Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think Putin has realized that Trump was desperate to get a summit with Putin, because Trump has been promising really since the election campaign that he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, which of course has not happened. And he kept talking about the fact that he would like to bring the war to an end, that he is a peacemaker. He wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And Trump has had some successes in creating peace conditions in other scenarios, like Azerbaijan and Armenia, like in Africa, Rwanda and Congo. He has had some success, but the big prize, of course, is the war in Gaza, which Trump has not been able to overcome at all. And the big prize is the war in Ukraine, which Trump also has been unable to overcome and end. And Putin knows that. So Putin knows that Trump is desperate to see and to show to his followers, to the American people, to the world, that he has made progress with bringing peace to Ukraine. And Putin is totally playing that and exploiting Trump's weaknesses. He knows that Trump is a very vain man, that he, needs to have his ego stroked, and that he wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And Putin has fully exploited that.
Man, some great takeaways there from our discussion there, Professor Lars. As I said, there were some noticeable differences between the first term between President Putin and President Trump, but there were some similarities as well. Has the relationship, do you think, changed at all in any way? We've pointed out how friendly they appear to be to one another, especially for what was supposed to be one of America's biggest adversaries. What are your thoughts on that?
No, not really. When you look at the first term, where Trump had several meetings with Putin and they got on famously, he confiscated the notes of the interpreters so that no one could know what actually was said during his bilateral talks with Putin. And he, during his first term, already said that Russia, of course, did not help him win the elections of 2016, that Russia did not meddle in the elections. The American intelligence network said exactly the opposite, but Trump dismissed that and believed Putin and Putin's promises that Russia did not meddle in the election campaign of 2016. We know for sure that Russia did meddle. We know for sure that Russia did try to influence American public opinion, and Trump has always dismissed that and he continues seeing Putin as a personal friend almost. And I think the difference between the first and the second term are very, very negligible. He still sees Putin as someone he can rely on. This is all very disconcerting. Only yesterday, I believe, Lavrov showed up with a shirt with the emblem of the USSR shown on the front of his shirt. And that, of course, indicates what Putin has said many years ago, that the downfall of the Soviet Union was a great geopolitical disaster for him, and that he essentially wants to resurrect as much of the political influence as he can possibly do of the old Soviet Union. And that applies to Ukraine, that applies probably to a large number of countries in Eastern Europe. And that the American president should be really chummy with that man who wants to recreate the Soviet Union, one of the biggest enemies the United States has ever had in the past. This is very disconcerting. And I wonder what, of course, the American military makes of that, what the American intelligence network makes of that, because the leaders and senior personnel in these important positions, they don't share that conviction that Russia and Putin has suddenly become a friend. They regard Russia and Putin still as an enemy, certainly as someone who needs to be viewed with great suspicion, and we can't see that is shared by President Trump. Trump seems to see him as a personal and loyal friend, which is, in my view, utterly mistaken.
Yeah, and I can't imagine the counterintelligence field day that I guess our forces or Russian forces may have with both presidents being in the same limo at one time. I guess we'll have to see what happens from that. I mean, pretty astonishing to hear Russian President Vladimir Putin even call out the president saying, come to Moscow as well. You alluded to that. So I guess we'll see what happens here. Obviously, both men had discussed, not at length, but just going into this meeting in Alaska that they weren't going to get a peace negotiation done at this place. They were only going to start. Do you expect that we will ever see a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, or are we just hoping for something that may never happen?
Well, I think Russia is not in a good position. Whatever Putin claims, and he tries to pretend that Russia is actually winning the war. But when you look at the last 15 months, then the Russians have conquered 1% additional Ukrainian territory. But they've lost over 400,000 soldiers, both killed ones and wounded ones, in order to obtain 1% additional territory. This is not what I would call conquest and great military success. The Russian economy is also under severe pressure. It is not collapsing, I'm not claiming that, but it is under severe pressure. And if the United States, if President Trump did impose secondary sanctions on countries which exported a lot of Russian oil, which finances the Russian war machine, if he did put secondary sanctions on countries such as India, perhaps even on China, this would be a severe problem for the Russian economy and for Putin's financial situation. And I think Putin knows that, and that's the reason why he wants to be very close to Trump and place him and pretends to be a friend of Trump's. So Trump has a lot of cards in his hands which he could play, but so far he has decided not to play them. If there were a meeting between Zelensky, Putin, and perhaps some European leaders, perhaps then, under proper conditions, under proper negotiations, a ceasefire could eventually be achieved. Because Putin cannot fight that war forever. Whatever he pretends, and Russian propaganda is very, very good. You look at RT, at Russia Today, that digital channel, they are very, very good in bringing their point of view across, and they persuade many people in the world of the Russian point of view. But in fact, the facts on the ground are much tougher to Russia and to Russia's warfighting capability than the Russians let on and than many of us believe. So Putin, in the end, will also have come to the table, and he will also have to agree to a ceasefire and then also to a proper peace treaty. But of course, it needs the Europeans to be present, and above all, it needs Zelensky to be present and discuss and talk to Putin. If you have to rely on Trump and Putin making a deal among themselves, then I think Ukraine is pretty much lost.
Man, just some great expert analysis by you, Professor Lars. Certainly appreciate you. My last thing is, I know you have to go at 8 o'clock for another interview, but anything else that maybe we should talk about or add to the conversation that comes up to you in your mind?
Yeah, what I would like to know is, we talk about Trump and Putin all the time, but there were other people in the room, particularly on the American side, Steve Witkoff and above all Marco Rubio. And Rubio essentially is a competent man. He's no pushover, so he also, of course, sucks up to President Trump all the time. But I wonder whether these other people, and there were also, of course, people on Putin's side like Lavrov, whether they were just sitting by and listening without saying anything, or whether they were actually perhaps bringing in some points which were not quite in agreement with Trump and Putin. That would be interesting to know whether there was actually some sort of discussion, maybe even a bit of a controversial discussion, or whether it was just shaking hands and agreeing with each other and there were no disagreements at all. Hopefully in the near future, some of the information will get leaked and we will learn more about that in the hopefully near future. But for the time being, we have to rely on that press conference, and that press conference was, I would say, a little shocking.
Professor Lars, I can only thank you for your time, but it is so good to have you here on WCNC Plus. We hope you will join us again. Again, thank you again for making the time for us here on WCNC Plus.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Have a great evening.